Hi everyone, welcome to an all-new Process Mining Café. Today we're talking about simulation and I'm joined by two simulation veterans. Welcome Lambros Viennas, Manufacturing Excellence Manager at Bridgnorth Aluminium, and Sudhendu, Head of Data-Driven Business Process Optimization at IIG. Hi Lambros, hi Sudhendu.
Hello everyone, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining, both. It's really great to have you here, and you both have worked with simulation for many years. And simulation is such an interesting topic because we are testing alternative what if scenarios without having to make the change in the real process yet, right? So for example, what if I had twice as many people, or what if I didn't do that step? What would be the effect on the process performance? And so in one of the articles that we published on the blog about process mining and simulation, I used the image of the astronaut Christoph Fuglsang, who participated in an underwater simulation to practice for space, basically. And Sudhendu, I know you are using the term wind tunnel, right, for your simulation framework at AIG. Is that correct?
Yes. So correct. And I mean, I have been using simulation for probably the last 2 decades. Simulation, as you know, is used in a wide range of industries, as you rightly said, to use it as a predictive tool. I've been using it mostly to model and analyze business processes, and we have looked at wide range of processes: banking, finance, insurance, accounting, and the like, print production. So as you've said in this discussion, we'll talk a lot about how we do simulation, and more particularly how this, I would say, the more recent field of process mining can be leveraged in conjunction with simulation to build some very realistic and powerful simulation models.
Right. And Lambros, do you also have like a term that you use?
I'm involved with simulation modeling for the past, let's say, 12, 14 years. As Sudhendu mentioned, as you mentioned as well, and simulation modeling is a great enhancer to decision making. And apart from dealing with complex problem situations, also helps us in situations when the cost of testing something is expensive or it is impossible to replicate something. You mentioned about an astronaut going to the space. You cannot simulate by using actual systems over there. Another example is simulators used by aircraft pilots.
Flight simulators, right?
It is an expensive thing to do it straight away, so and safer as well to do with a simulation.
Yeah, exactly. And it is so alluring, right? So having the ability to try out alternative, what if I did that, without having to make this huge change and having these huge costs in real life. So I think simulation has been something that has been very interesting for people, but at the same time, especially like if we look at business processes, it's not used as much, right? It has been around for many decades. It's much older as a technique. It's available, has been available much longer than process mining, for example. But so on the one hand side, people see why it can be very attractive to have that, but it's not so easy, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why it's maybe not used more, is that it's maybe not as simple as one could think, but it's actually quite complicated to do a good simulation model.
Simulation modeling is around here for decades, as you said. We are we're blessed by having all this new digital technology that enhances the capacity of the simulation modeling, as with other technologies as well. So apart from getting the numbers right, we now have visual, the ability of having a much better visual understanding of how a model represents our perception of a complicated system.
Yeah, exactly. And process mining is one of these new additions that can really be helpful to use simulation. And so we want to look at the combination of process mining and simulation into today's session. And to all of you out there, to all of you out there watching right now, as a reminder, you can participate in this discussion, so you can join the chat. It's just below this video what you're watching right now. You don't need any name, or you just need your name, but you don't need any account or any password or something like that. You just enter your name, and then you can be in the chat and you can talk with us, and we will keep an eye on what you are saying and pick up the points during the discussion. Now, so before we go into the detailed steps that you can take to build a simulation model with the help of process mining, we want to clarify a little bit the difference between the two, because sometimes there's also some confusion, and so for that. I have a very simple example here that I want to show. So you see an example here from a credit card application process. It's actually an example that we built for an explainer video some time ago. And so when you replay the animation in the process mining tool, you see moving tokens, right? Every yellow dot is one case, one credit card application moving through the process. And sometimes people who see these kind of a dynamic view of the process think, oh, this is a simulation. Maybe because they have seen in a modeling tool, in a BPM modeling tool, kind of a simulation, and it looks a little bit similar, so they think it's a simulation. But actually it's not a simulation, but it's an animation. It's a replay of the actual process. And that's an important difference when we're looking at simulation and process mining. So I have like one slide that I made here to illustrate that. Let me just bring that up and see to explain what I mean. So if you're looking at process mining and simulation, then you see on the left side, process mining is really about understanding the current process, right? We are using the current behavior, and we use that to understand how the process currently is. And we're looking in the past to understand how the process is at the moment. But with simulation, what we usually try to do is we want to predict the future, and we want to play out different alternative what-if scenarios. So that's a good point to keep in mind. But to be able to do that, we need a very good model as a starting point for making these what-if scenarios. And that model really needs to reflect the reality. And that's one of the crucial points when making a simulation model, right? Getting to the model, that's the really complicated step here.
Well, conceptualization of the problem situation is of a paramount importance. Unless if you will understand the problem, and unless if you will not establish your priorities from the beginning, then most probably you will fail. And as you have showed in the slide that we saw before, it is historical data that a simulation modeler will take under consideration in order to establish a good understanding of the surrounding conditions. And this is where process mining helps with all the artificial intelligence that encapsulates to act as an aid to the modeler.
Yeah, and just to clarify, we're working with discrete event simulation here mostly in this session. We will talk about. Yes,
we will discuss about discrete event simulation, which is a more, let's say, easier to understand paradigm. However, all the other different types of simulation model that you will refer to in a moment are very well covered from process mining.
Okay.
Yes, and just to add to what you just both of you discussed, I mean, if you look at simulation, as you said rightly, it's the idea is to build a model of the actual process, and then what was missing in the past is that we did not have very detailed insight into what was actually happening in the process. So when being is complemented with or combined with simulation, because process mining works largely with event logs and attributes of those event logs, get very precise insights, very good diagnostics into the process, and then you can leverage that to, as you said, in the second part of the problem solving, which is how do you actually use that to build models which are very realistic without having to make as many assumptions. You still have to make some assumptions, but not as many assumptions that you would have to make if you did not go and leverage the process mining analysis prior to the simulation model.
Right, exactly. So we need this model as a starting point for the simulation to do these what-if analysis, and getting to this model is the big problem. So this is where process mining can help and make this a little bit easier. It doesn't solve everything automatically, magically, but it brings us quite a step closer to being able to do that more realistically and also more efficiently.
Both methods work in parallel. There is a synergy between process mining and simulation modeling, to my experience at least, and it is very powerful, not only for the conception but also for the later stages of the modeling.
Right. And so what we have prepared here for you today is that we want to go through the 5 steps that you need to go through when you want to build a simulation model, and explain where process mining comes in and what are the things also that you need to pay attention to, right? And just as an overview, so these 5 stages are, we go to a slide here that shows these 5 steps. So the first step is that we need to understand the structure of the process. Then we need to derive the parameters for the simulation model. Then we need to validate the model. Then change the model to reflect the what-if scenarios, and then we do the before and after comparison. And so we start with the beginning and start from the beginning. So the first point is understanding the structure of the process, right? And so for that, we can actually go back to this example here, but go back not to the model, but actually to the data, because that's exactly where process mining helps us, where if we look at this Excel sheet here, we have a very simple example of this credit application example where we just see the minimum requirements that we need for process mining. We have a case ID, which is the application number. We have the activity names of the steps that are happening. And then we have, in this case, a start and completion timestamps. So this is the historical information that we can get out of an IT system, right? Maybe for the people who are more coming from the simulation side and are new to process mining, that's the minimum requirements that you need in the process mining data to be able to do process mining. And then in the process mining tool, you import that data, and then here we open this file, we make the mapping to what the case ID is, what the activity name is, what the timestamps are, and then the process mining tool automatically builds a model that reflects how the process is really running. And so at first, it's often a good idea to look at just a simplified version of the process, so we can see if everything goes right, or let's say in most of the cases, and fortunately that's the scenario where everything goes right. We see that after the application, we see the verification step, then there's a credit check, and then there's an approval step, and then there's a send card step, right? So that's a good scenario. But if we bring in less frequent activities, then, and even all of the paths, then we see a more complicated map where we see that there's sometimes some rework, something has to be sent back, and also the credit check, sometimes it's skipped, right? We go directly from verify application to proof. So that's basically, process mining gives us the structure of the process. And so that's something, if you build a simulation model in a manual way, you would do that how would you do that? By observation or by speaking with the people in the process?
Yeah, so I mean, the way we would typically do this is, we would talk to the domain expert who has a understanding of the process, try to get a sense of, what are the important activities they perform, and then lay out the structure and use some tool like, AnyLogic or Arena, whatever. There are many simulation tools, and you would lay it out in that tool and basically build the structure. I think whereas you just showed in your example, the actual process could have a lot of details, right? Like you showed things like those rework loop. If you look at a very high level, you might miss some of those steps. But when you're looking at the simulation model, and if you miss some of those steps, it could have a big impact on the simulation model, or it could not have a big impact, depending on what is the impact of not including or excluding that step. Yeah. So by going back and forth between the simulation model, I think you still need to involve the domain experts, right? Because they will provide some additional color to the problem from experience. But now you have data, and the event data and the model that you've derived, the process mining model that you've derived, can start giving you those insights as to what part of the structure is critical and what part is not critical. So the overall, in even setting up the simulation model, the structure of the simulation model, you can leverage process mining effectively.
Yeah, exactly. That's such an important point. And also, maybe this also comes back to something that you touched upon a little bit earlier already. It's about the goal that we have also for the animation for the simulation, right? So I think if you're a process miner who is looking to maybe use simulation or to use process mining to build a simulation model, you don't need to think that every little detail that you discover using the process mining tool needs to be in the simulation model, but you really have to think about what's the level of abstraction or the level of detail that you need in the model, and that really depends on what you want to simulate and what you want to analyze with the simulation scenarios. So for example, so it's a mix of what you want to use it for, but also maybe what is needed to reflect reality, right? So like Sudhendu said, so some things might be not very frequent. You see, that's actually a very simple example that we see here. Often the real world processes are much more complicated. They have all kinds of variation, and you have this big spaghetti model. It's not a good idea to take this spaghetti model and put that in a simulation tool. It's just going to be chaos. And so, for example, in this model here, if we see this kind of rework loop, if that's a big part of the problem or of the process, maybe I might want to include that. But actually, if I look, for example, that's the good thing about process mining, I can quantify, right? So how frequently does that happen? For example, if I click on this send back path activity here, I can say filter this activity, and then I can say, okay, this is a rework, right? So these are just the rework cases. And if I look at that, I see it's just 2% of all the cases. So it's not very big percentage. So I could actually make the case and say, well, let's just look at the process, but not include these rework cases. And we say just no rework, and that's kind of. Oh, sorry. Now I have combined them both, but of course I want only the no rework one here. So then I have removed all the cases that go through this rework step, and that still reflects a large portion of all the data. So it depends on how close you want to show the process, but that could be enough to say, well, let's simplify and get the essence of the process right into the model.
You're very right about that. And if you could go back to the first picture of the single line model, the simplified one.
Oh, the simplified one.
Yes, please. This is how everything starts. Whenever you start a modeling exercise, you discuss the problem with the stakeholders, and you are presented, let's say, something that we see on the monitor right now. Okay, and when you get your data, then you realize that reality is much different situation. It's something completely different on many occasions. But with what you demonstrated previously, you can easily, without ruining the importance of significant factors, significant variables, you can exclude some outliers from your model, making your model easier to be implemented and focus on the more significant variables of the system. Yeah. So as you understand, this is a great help for the modeler, because you are not blindfolded. You have a visual understanding of how significant a variable is and how variability is expressed within the system. So it is a great help.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is one thing that you can leave out things like we had here, where we said, okay, let's focus on maybe the no rework is simplified enough, but you can also choose to leave out details, right? That's maybe another thing to keep in mind. When you're building a simulation model, in the system data from the IT systems, you often get a lot of details. Every little status update and changes are logged, but you don't necessarily need all of them, but maybe you you are better off building your simulation model based on milestones in the process that really reflect something that's happening. So for example, if we're looking at the timing here, the performance is the problem in this particular process. It's taking too long. So if we're looking at the throughput times and maybe the average times, then we see that the latter part of the process does not really matter that much anymore, right? So we could choose to say, well, let's abstract from that and let's leave out the send rejection letter and send card part. We don't need to simulate that. We want to simulate the rest of the process. So then with the process mining tool, you can just basically choose to ignore some of the things. So for example, what was it? Send rejection letter, and what was the last one? Send card, right? These two. I can just deselect them, basically hiding them from the map, making it simpler. So that's, I think, what we wanted to discuss here about the structure of the process, right? Process mining helps you to show that, but then you still need to be deliberate about what you actually need to reflect based on how big the portion of that behavior is, but also how simple and how detailed you need to make the model.
Process mining is basically giving a solid understanding to the problem situation with regards to the significance of many relationships within the system. And if you will compare it with the spreadsheet you showed in the beginning, I would like to go for process mining output. Yeah. To be honest with you.
Yes.
Yes, and you said, when you build a simulation model, it's important to understand right up front, right, what is the objective of the model that you're building? Is your focus to look at, let's say, it could be multiple things, but is it quality control? If that's important, then you probably don't want to ignore what you just discussed, right? If you're like the rework part, if you're really interested in utilization, and you see, as you said, that there's a very small impact on utilization by ignoring that rework step, then you can ignore it, right? So it's how you decide to process the information that the process mining model is telling you will also depend on what you're trying to do with the model. Because model, no matter what you say, is still abstraction of the reality, right? It is exactly. It's not reality. And some people think that by putting too much detail, you can necessarily reflect the reality, but that may not be the case, because sometimes even putting in too much detail can actually clutter the model, and you might start instead of getting more insights, you might actually lose insights, I would say. So it's a very important thing to trade off as to start with what is your objective that you're trying to build the simulation model for. And then use the insights that your process mining model is providing you, the very detailed data-driven insight. And the other thing I would like to mention is that when you build a model, and let's say you have stakeholders, one of the critical challenges that you would face is, how do you convince that your model is the right model, so to speak, right? But if you have the data and you can go back and forth between the process mining and what, like a simple example that you showed, it also helps with instilling confidence in your simulation model, because now you can, if there are questions, or you ignored the rework, you can actually go back and show that, it only accounts for 2%. And if your utilization is your important metric that you're trying to address with your simulation model, people will agree. Yeah. In the past, you would have to just take on faith that, I'm going to ignore rework for now. But you may not have those types of insights. And by combining these two frameworks, you can get to that point that, you can build trustworthy models that reflect the reality and to the extent that is needed to address the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point that's coming back again and again in different situations, but that process mining really can help build trust also in these kind of models, in these analysis results that you present to people, which they should use to base their decisions on. But if that's a black box, it's a little bit, maybe you don't trust that it's right? But if you can understand how it arrived there, then that's actually trust building. So that's really nice
As Sudhendu mentioned, it is a brilliant verification tool. So to see whether this is the right model in a modeling exercise is very important. Imagine that you're modeling a factory, a process, okay, whatever, an organization, and you think that you're modeling right, but you're modeling something else. I don't know, you start modeling an insurance company, but you end up modeling something different. So the output will be definitely wrong.
Yeah.
Process mining is the ultimate, I believe, verification tool to work along with stakeholders. And everyone who's in the business knows that from the point you will win your stakeholders, the people who participate into this modeling exercise, it is the determinant factor for the success of the project itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's really good. I think that's a really strong point here. Maybe to just briefly come back to the first point that you mentioned, Sudhendu, this working together with the people and finding the right level, right? It's like there's a saying that all models are wrong, but some are more useful. So it's really about making the model as useful as it can for the purpose that we need it to. And so I think in the past, when we talked about how you use simulation, and by the way, there's a lot of examples. So Sudhendu in the past shared some concrete cases from how he combined process mining with simulation. And there's some articles also that we had on the blog. We will link all of these together with the recording in the show notes when we publish the Café in 1 or 2 weeks or so. So watch out for that. So what you mentioned there is that you also sometimes aggregate data even, right? So it's not just about leaving out steps like I just showed here, which you can easily do in the process mining tool, but sometimes you also aggregate things together, or you reduce variation to simplify the model to the right level. And I think that's an important thing to understand. It's not just that you can automatically generate the simulation model with process mining. It's not going to be useful if it's too detailed. So I think that's a really important step here in this first step of this 5-step kind of process.
Yes. I mean, that's another very good point you brought up. Like when you use process mining, a lot of times you have to pull data from different systems and then kind of fuse them because if you have let's say if you have a complex end-to-end process, parts of the process mining data or the event data may be coming from one system, another data may be coming from another system, and they may be, two completely separate systems. And when they were designed, for example, they were not designed for process mining studies. So people have captured events to the extent that, made sense for that particular system. And when you put things together, you get data that is at different levels of granularity, right? And as an example, you have some event-based systems these days that you can configure them that they can capture every click, for example, that's happening on your computer, and that could be just overwhelming data, right? So when you put that into process mining, of course, you will get a very detailed process map, but your simulation model doesn't need to be at that level of detail. So you can then look at your process mining and some of the tools that you have, for example, the sliders that you have in Disco, and try to sort of see, what is the right level of aggregation of these event logs and activities that you want to use for simulation modeling, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to perform some task on a website, you might be doing 15 different clicks on a single web page. But your objective from a simulation model could be, when did I log into that web page and when did I exit from that web page, right? And there'll be, as you know, simulation also uses statistical distributions, and I know we'll get into that. So a lot of this variability will be aggregated within that statistical distribution.
Yeah, exactly.
So it really helps, but you have that fine-grained data. You can use that to aggregate to the level that you want for your simulation model.
Yeah. And this needs to be a deliberate step based on what you want to do. Yeah. So maybe before we go to the second step, it's a good opportunity to pick up one question from the chat, where Ranjit is asking whether machine learning and AI will replace simulation in the future. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Machine learning and artificial intelligence are completely different disciplines. As if with process mining, which is an artificial intelligence-based discipline, are working together. I could see that machine learning and artificial intelligence will be a great enhancer and a great help to provide simulation modeling and models, generally speaking, regardless if they are simulation models or not, with the required data. As we said before, there are systems which is very expensive or impossible to get data. I couldn't even imagine getting data from the Mars for creating a new rover to send it to Mars. Therefore, I would definitely use machine learning and artificial intelligence based on information collected from the existing systems we have sent into Mars to enhance the new technology that we will suggest. I cannot see that they work one against the other, or one will succeed or for example, there will be an evolution from simulation to machine learning. They work in conjunction, they work together.
Yeah. Yes, and I'll just add one more point. I mean, I think just like we are talking about process mining enhancing simulation, I think you can use some aspects of machine learning and predictive modeling to embellish your simulation model, so to speak, especially if you start bringing in, because the way simulation works, it's largely you are working with, as I said, statistical distributions that describe the different activities in a process, right? And you could potentially, one way I can see is you can put some type of predictive model to get more sort of stratification in your simulation model, where you could use a combination of machine learning and the existing simulation framework to get even better insights. And we have done that in a few cases. So it's still, in my view, I would say that there's a lot of work that's required to combine the two. But definitely there are synergies between machine learning and simulation. I wouldn't say that one is going to replace the other or vice versa. It's more like adding more power to your simulation model if you can use some kind of factor-based machine learning or predictive modeling embedded into your simulation model.
Right. Yeah, different types of techniques for prediction, for example, in this case. It's good to keep that in mind. There are these different approaches sometimes to achieve the same thing, right? And all of them have their advantages and disadvantages, assumptions that they perhaps make or preconditions that need to be met. For example, if we're talking about what-if analysis, it's actually not always necessary to use simulation for that, but there are many examples, and we don't focus on that here in the session today, but many what-if questions can be answered with process mining alone. For example, if you're doing a process mining analysis and you see that there's a kind of an undesired path, kind of a rework scenario that happens, but you also have the population of the cases that don't do this rework step, right? You can very easily make a measurement of how much time does it take if this rework is done compared to when it's not done. And if you then make a what if scenario, like what if instead of 70% of the time I'm going through this unnecessary step, I reduce that to just 30%, then I can make an assessment based on what my average process performance will be, right? Just based on the process mining measurements without any simulation at all. So that depends. But I think for simulation, especially because you're building the model on the right level of detail, as we discussed, but because you're building this model, you have that model to work with, right? That's where you can really tweak properties of the model. And so maybe that's a good transition to the second step, because once we have the structure, like what are the activities and what are the connections between them and the path in the process, and there's still the second ingredient, which is basically the parameters of the model. How long do these activities take? But also, how are the percentages, like when you path percentages or probabilities, how you go through which path, right? So for example, if we look at our example again, we can see the mean durations, or we could pick the median, for example. But if we're looking at the frequency, we can also look, for example, the percentages. Like for example, here, what's the percentage of going to this rework step? It's 11% compared to going directly, or this direct approval step. So Yeah, so these are the parameters that you can also take out of the process mining analysis into the simulation model, right?
Yes. So again, one of the when you're building a complex process model, you do have these decision blocks, right, that you put in place where a service request might come in, and some may go on one path, another one might go another path, or there may be multiple branches, so to speak, from the decision point. If you didn't have process mining, how would you decide that? You would talk to the experts who have been involved in this process. Let's say if it's an existing process, and they'll tell you, what, at this point, service request comes and it goes to path 1 or path 2, and typically we would say 40% goes to path 1 and 60% goes to path 2, and you might use that anecdotal information from these, I would call them the domain experts, and put that in your model. And as we all know, if you have the process mining, you will get that very accurately, right? You can actually look at your historical data and you'll see, no, it's not 60-40, it's actually 55. Right? Now, in some cases, you might say it's ballpark, but it's right. But a lot of times what you'll see is if you have many of these decision blocks, and if you have small errors like 5-10% in each block, you'll see the impact of that on the overall simulation model can be quite significant. So getting those numbers relatively right or close to right is very important. And so just like as you showed, when you have any activity block and you look at the data and it exactly tells you, what the mean median are, or you can actually even do statistical distribution fits on that data. I think combining what we just talked about, the structure, and then both aggregating or ignoring paths, and then using real data from these models to build these statistical distributions that you plug into your simulation model, that makes your simulation model far more authentic and more realistic, right? Representation of the reality, as opposed to, putting a lot of these through, assumptions or talking to people and having them provide you these kind of average estimates, so to speak.
Right. And that contributes to what we discussed in the beginning, that the model, the simulation model that we built is a much better reflection of the reality, right? And therefore it's a good starting point for doing these what-if scenarios, because you have to start with a close reflection of reality if you want to get that right. Otherwise, the basis isn't.
Yes, and just one more point I'll add. So fundamentally, if you look at what you're doing with process mining, you're looking at historical data. So everything has already happened, right? So what you're looking at is one realization of how that process worked over the last month, last year, or whatever the time frame is. But whatever it is, it's already happened. So in that sense, it is deterministic, even though you are seeing a lot of the variations, because what you're seeing is one instance of the process. The future doesn't work like that, right? The future is unpredictable. The different steps that you have in the process, you don't know what instance of that will actually happen in the future. So that's why you need simulation, right? So you need to model all those possibilities in some statistical way and come up with good estimates of what you think the future might look like. And then base your decisions on that. So that's like a fundamental difference between the past and the future, right? Past is known, and even though you learn a lot from the past, but with all of that, predicting the future because of the inherent uncertainty in what might actually happen, you need to actually build the model and then test it across all those possibilities. As an example, if you put a statistical distribution, right? Let's say you put a normal distribution. If you look at historically, at any service request that came in, even though it was normally distributed at a particular step, you knew at what the value was because it's already happened. But in the future, it could pick any value from the normal distribution. And as you can see, if you have a variety of these types of service blocks with all these different distributions applied there, depending on what each instance or realization of that value is, your output of the model can become very different. So that's why the way you use simulation model to predict is you run many replications once you build the model. of the model, and then look at statistical estimates of what the model is saying.
Let's maybe look at these statistical distributions first, because when we build the model, so we're still in the phase of building the model. First the structure, and then the parameters, and we can get both the structure and a lot of the parameters from the cross-mining analysis. Now, based on this example, Sudhendu actually was building a simulation model in any logic. So we have that here. So there you actually reflected most of the structure from these simple steps here. And this is any logic is a simulation tool, one of the many. It's a quite it's a relatively complex tool because you can do a lot of things in there. So it's not that easy, and we couldn't kind of show it live how to build it, but you can see the structure back from the process map that we had in Disco, right? Where here this is a starting point, and then we see the beginning, then there's the verification step, and so then in the end there's the approve and the reject step. Now, so the structure can be inferred from our discovered process model from the process-mining tool, but then we're talking about these different parameters. And so, for example, if I select any of these kind of activities here, what you can see here, what Sudhendu has done is that he approximated the time that this particular step takes based on, in this case, a triangular distribution. But that's already a choice, right? So in Disco, for example, we can see if we go back and to the performance, we can see certain kind of mean, median. Of course, out of the process-mining tool, we could also export all of the instances, for example, all of the credit check activities that were performed, and we could export kind of each instance of those activities with the time it took. But that's not a distribution yet. So you have to, and usually most service processes in any case are not normally distributed. So you can't just put a normal distribution on there. And so how, I'm curious, how do you deal with that? So for example, also maybe Lambros, how do you do distribution fittings? How do you determine what's the right distribution?
Well, the first attempt is to fit the data to a well-known and established distribution. And that makes things much more easier in terms of determining further investigation to the variables. However, from the data, from the historical data, you can isolate a steady period of operation. One of the requirements for descriptive simulation is to get information from a steady period of time without a lot of fluctuation or trends. So you need to handle your data somehow, and from that data you derive empirical distributions. So from process mining straight away, if you will go to the statistics, you will be able to see over there the empirical distribution, and it is up to the choice of the modeler to get as much granularity as they wish to determine the bin size, as we're calling it, and include a much more educated inputs to the input variables to the model. That will be much more representative to the system itself. Yeah,
and that shows, right? It's not an easy or direct answer for that. So it really depends on the data, on the distribution.
It takes time and raises the cost for any type of model. So if you have a tool that will do it for you, you're a happy man at the end of the day. Also, coming back to what we've mentioned before, apart from having these distributions in front of your eyes, you also get not a picture, but a moving picture. It is a motion picture of your problem. You see how this distribution is established. Do you have great change during the beginning, during the end of a period? It depends, but it is in front of your eyes. You can use it. You can export it and use it straight away in your model.
Yeah. I would say that's the big advantage of process mining, right? That you can experience the process. And I think one big advantage of process mining is also that you don't need to represent everything in one model. Actually, and we have many examples for that, you can look at the process from different angles. You can build a model very detailed, a very high-level model, one model where you unfold a certain dimension, and you can look at it dynamically from this perspective, from that perspective. And all of these models together give you this understanding of the process. And like you're saying, looking at the animation can give you some intuitive understanding of what's really happening, right? So this is something that process mining can really provide. And is an advantage, whereas in simulation, in the simulation model, you have to really represent depending on the goal that you want to, for that particular goal that you want to achieve, but you have to put everything in one model. And yeah, to get that right, I think the distributions are so interesting, because it seems very easy at first. Oh, you get all the measurements here from the post-mining tool, but it's a choice still, right? So for example, here if we look at the triangular solution, Sudhendu, that you chose, we discussed this when we were preparing the session, is that sometimes you need to remove some outliers if the triangular distribution might be a good approximation. But often what we see in post-mining, I'm not sure whether I have this here, if we're looking just at the case duration, for example, what often happens is that you have maybe one or few or three really crazy outliers, right? And we have a blog post about that as well. I will link it in the show notes too, whether you should remove outliers for post-mining or not. And usually in the post-mining world, not necessarily. So often you want to see these outliers and you want to take them into consideration, and you don't really need to remove them. But here we are in a situation where you actually need to think about removing outliers, because if you're trying to make a distribution that represents the process, and you have these one or two crazy long-running cases or instances where the task was running really long, then that could completely misrepresent the data, right? So Sudhendu, you mentioned you're sometimes removing outliers then before making the triangular distribution.
Yes, I mean, if you choose to be typically this is the practice in simulation, is if you don't have enough data, triangular distribution is what people typically use, right? And if you look at triangular distribution, there are three parameters, right? One is the minimum, the other is the maximum, and the mode. And how do you get that, right? You talk to the people and they'll tell you, well, on the average, it takes me 5 minutes. The minimum sometimes I can do it in 2 minutes, and maximum is about 10 minutes. So you take that anecdotal information and you can fit in your distribution, put it in the simulation model. What you just showed is you can now look exactly what that is, right? Because you have data, and you'll see that it may not be 2, 5, and 10. You may have some which took 20. But there may be just outliers. There may be just 2 cases out of 1,000 so you can eliminate those outliers.
Yeah.
And then, is 10 the right number or is 8 the right number? Assuming that, a triangular distribution is a good fit, you can actually do very realistic. So it's data-driven simulation, but with a lot of these accuracies, and so the trust that you can place in your model certainly goes up if you use this approach.
Yeah.
Moreover, I would like to add, if we could go back to the distribution that you demonstrated previously, it might not necessarily be something wrong over here. We might probably talking about different products, different periods of time.
Yeah.
For example, if the high peak, for example, let me give you an example. A bottling company, okay, they're preparing to start selling their beverages or beer before summertime, okay, in the Northern Hemisphere. So I would expect to see something like that. So this might not be something that we would like to exclude, okay, but it would be something that we should take under consideration with another variable into our model.
Yeah.
Okay, so once again, it is educated information. Instead of following the oracle, let's say, approach, okay, we go to the oracle and get the answer. We have something which is substantially supported with hard evidence, which is something, again, very, very scientific. It is undisputed. It is reality.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And yeah, so I'm still thinking about the topic of the distribution fitting, because that's way too complicated that we can go into it here in detail, right? But there's also ways to automate, to do that automatically. So somehow to find which distribution really fits. But isn't there also a way where you can actually use the instance data? So where we could take all the post-mining measurements as they are, right? Lambros, you mentioned all of them. They are there for a reason. If
you will go back to the example, if I would let's say like to focus on the middle period, Okay, so we have three. Let's say we have three modes over here into this big distribution, and I would like to isolate the middle period. So I would isolate the data within that period of time, and use that particular empirical distribution as it is in my model. So there is a way to create within the simulation tools. There is a way to create empirical distributions. So you define for how long, what is the frequency. Okay, and the system will take it and use that probability distribution to run the simulator, do the sampling, okay, based on random numbers. So more or less, discrete event simulation, this is the way it works. It has a random number generator, which every time changes the random number seed, okay, and simulates different samples for a big population. Yeah. At the end of the day, you're basically simulating, based on the central limit theorem, you're simulating the whole of the population very accurately.
And that's exactly what I meant. So empirical distribution was the term for that. And you're right. So within the process-mining tool, we can select the time frames, for example, to get a representative time area, or select the subsets that we want to use. So that's what you can do simply through the filtering in the process-mining tool. But then, what would be your recommendation, or what's your experience? Are you typically trying to approximate through, for example, some triangular distribution, or do you think process miners who are, want to go into the simulation approach perhaps in the future, should they be looking at empirical distributions right away? What is your experience with that?
Well, I believe that the literature is very clear on what should be done. Okay, ideally you have to be based on a well-established distribution, but this is not the case all the time. You have so much variability around you that completely destroys normality. For example, it is not easy to isolate sometimes the effects. You have covariance. You have many other characteristics that ruin this very nice bubble we wish to get in, to get into a comfort zone statistically, let's say. So technically speaking, the best approximation is empirical distributions for me, because it gives me much more leeway to express more of the variability, and also it gives us the opportunity of changing slightly the process, affecting that empirical distribution and checking what if scenarios. Or in optimization problems, we can affect directly this distribution and see how the system behaves.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, and just to add to what he said, yes, I mean, if you have the data, and you just have to be careful that you need to have sufficient amount of data, right, to bootstrap, as it's called, from the empirical data. And typically what I have seen is, if you're building a complex end-to-end process, in many instances you do have the data, right? But in cases that you don't have the data, then you may have to still rely on some approximate distribution. And typically people just use triangular distribution, because that's the simplest to get when you don't have the data about a process, right? You can always talk to someone, and if it's an existing process, and get the triangular distribution, and that's why it's so popular. But you have to realize that there are, again, every time you do that, you are introducing a little bit of uncertainty into the model, and that's why you will see, and I'm assuming you'll get to that point, is that when you take all of this and plug it into your simulation model and run the simulation model, it won't be that what the process mining shows is what the simulation model will show.
Yeah, and we come to that in a moment, exactly. But before we get there, just one more thing. So we wanted to also show a little bit the places where you need to parameterize the simulation model, and also to show that there's also choices, like how far do you go, right? So for example, we just talked about the timing information, which we can get out of the discovered process model, both for the execution times, how long are the steps in the process taking, but also the waiting times in between steps. But there's other elements. For example, how often do you get new cases, right? So for example, if we're looking at active cases over time, then we see, there's new cases coming in, right? We can actually just look at the start timestamp here for the cases, and then we see, okay, new cases are coming into the process. But these might be also different types of cases, right? Lambros, you said that very rightly. Maybe it's different products. So then you actually, should you model that? Should you have kind of
straight away you can see when you start having a steady state into your system. So from a point you will reach the steady state. This is So if you will move your mouse a bit to the left there. So after let's say a couple of time units to the right, then you can assume that you have, from what we can see over there, without running any other statistical metrics, you can see that after a point you reach a steady state, and this is the point when you will start sampling for more data for all the variables. Okay, and this is a big help. This is a big help.
Exactly. Yes. And this is what we get. So we get also how many cases are coming into the system, but then also the other thing is just to show how complicated it can get, right? So for example, maybe if we go back to the full model again, also with the rework that we had. So if we're looking here at the percentages, we see the choice percentage, right? Going left versus going right. What's the probability that I take this path compared to that path? That's, like you said, Sudhendu, earlier, it's like can be really helpful to have accurate percentages for that, even if it's just small places, but they can add up over the time of the process. So we can then if we go to the simulation model, for example, here we have a choice point there where we can see that probability reflected, right? But just to show like how complicated it can become is like sometimes you can go through a loop more than once. So usually if you can go through a loop maybe twice, 3, 4, 5 times, then the probability to go through that loop again is not the same every time, but once you have done it once and you get there to the second time, the probability usually is lower that you do it a second time again, and then the third time again it's lower, right? So that's just one example, like where is that something that needs to be reflected in the simulation model. And that's also where you see different capabilities of simulation tools. So for example, one of the BPM bloggers that I used to read a few years ago was called he's called Bruce Silver, and he was always complaining like that the BPM tools had all simulation in there, but he called them kind of being a fake feature because they were very basic. And that was always one of the things that he mentioned, like that these kind of conditional branching probabilities that you could not model that. So that's, I think, one thing that nowadays simulation tools are really capable, and they can model everything. That's why they're so complicated also. But it also shows that you have to think about what you need to reflect, right?
Yeah, and to that point of what this gentleman was mentioning, I mean, if you just take, I said, the data that you have that you're using to do process mining is the past, right? Mm-hmm. And if you just use that past to say that this is how the future is going to be look like, which you would do if you just took that and call that your simulation model, right? It's not right. So what you need to really do is you need to build your simulation model, but plug in all the appropriate and critical uncertainty. And that could be of many kinds, right? It could be uncertainty associated with the processing time delays. It could be uncertainty associated with the branching that you are seeing in your model. But then what you're doing with process mining and the analysis that you've looked is, you're making much, much more informed decisions as you're introducing those uncertainties into the model. Once you have the model, you still have to go and run it across, a large number of possibilities to make sure you have looked at all the what I would call the interaction between the variabilities that you have put into your model. Yeah. But you can't just go straight forward, and that's why I like the fact that you right up front in this discussion you brought up the fact that if you just take the process mining, it's animation. That's not simulation. Yeah. And it becomes simulation only once you have gone through what we have just all these things that you have discussed.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and run the model, right? So that's basically then once you've put in the structure and all the parameters, you can run the model. And so we can do this here in the simulation model that you've built. And let me see whether it starts. It should bring up kind of a new screen. And basically based on the parameters, now it runs through like one scenario, right? And we can, if we stop it, we can run it again. That's also what you mentioned before. It's like, because it's probabilistic, it's like often that you don't run a simulation once, but you actually have replications of multiple replications, and then you run the model many times, and that can be done automatically also, and then you measure kind of the average performance based on the different replications, right?
Yes. So, for example, in this case, let's say if your goal of interest is the average time from the time a request is received to the time the request is actually delivered, the turnaround time, if you want to call that. If you run the simulation model once, you'll get one value for that turnaround time, right? If you run it with a different seed, you'll get a slightly different value. So let's say you get, 10 hours or for the turnaround time for the 10,000 requests that you processed, and the average you get is 10 hours. Then if you run it with slightly different seed, you won't get 10 hours, right? You might get 10.5 hours, or you might get 11 hours. When you run it with a different seed, when I say a different seed, what it does is that simulation is run with where different values will be picked from the distributions that you have assigned. And as you keep running this many times, you'll get a distribution of of the metric of interest, in this case, turnaround time. And then if you run it sufficiently large number of times, you can be confident that the model output, the turnaround time, is a good reflection of what you might expect in the future.
Yeah.
So, and that's what you can do. About the future, you can't predict exactly 10 days from now, when a service request came in, exactly how much time it will take. You can't, because it has all this variability that you have to take into account. Whereas with process mining, if you went back and looked at a particular request 10 days ago, you can exactly say when it came in, because it's already happened. Whereas the future has not yet happened, and it is all driven by these statistical probabilities. So the best you can do with the simulation is, you can come up with your measure of the distribution, mean, or standard deviations, or the like, and you can have some confidence as to how accurately you can predict that.
Yeah. And so that's such an important step. We are now at step number 3, where we validate the model. And here there's, mind you, there's not any what if modeled yet, right? We are not talking about what if at all. We are just trying to reflect the current process as closely as we can, or on the right level of abstraction as we find it to be useful, but correctly as we can in this model. And so that's this validation step then involves comparing also properties of the process that we can observe based on the process mining compared to what we see in the process model. So for example, here we would look at the turnaround time for the overall process, and we could compare that with what we have observed in the process mining tool, and see how different it is. And so the question is then also like to be aware of the gaps, right? So maybe you never get it to 100% to match, but what's your experience? How close should you be for the target metric that you want to analyze?
You were very right to say that you have not reached the point of running what-if scenarios. Before you will do any what-if scenarios or any optimization, you need to prove that your model is a valid one.
Yes.
Okay, that's what you get represents what you think that you are modeling. And this is the point where you have to see the convergence to your existing real-life system based on the assumptions and simplification that you have made for this system. Of course, convergence cannot be an absolute one. And of course, we have random events in real-life systems. Therefore, you are based on the historical data you have and the picture you get from process mining to drive you towards a well-educated decision. Is this right? Yes. Okay. Is this something that I want to experiment with? Yes, it is. And therefore, from that point, you start creating more replications. You build trials with many replications, and you attempt to see how significantly correct you are based on your assumptions and simplifications. The closer you get to your target, the better for you. Now, at this point, you might end up seeing some cases of a complete departure from where you want to converge. this is a point that you have to ring the bell and say, I'm missing a value over here, I'm missing a variable.
Yeah.
This is the point where you know for sure as a modeler that you have missed something which is significant.
Yeah, exactly. And it could be something like before where we said, well, there's actually different processes for different products.
Yes,
so maybe that needs to be...
something within the complexity. Complexity can be structural complexity based on the contents. It can be dynamic complexity based on the interactions within the system, and also it can be emerging complexity. So we see many cases, we see that there are phenomena that occur that have went outside our scope initially, but as we're modeling a system, we start building trust that they are there. So we identify them. And this is the point where you decide whether something is important for your model and you are taking into consideration, or you are excluding it. But you have to mention it.
Yes.
Or you have to create another model to cover this particular case, if it is important, according to the stakeholders, of course.
Yeah. Exactly. And it can be that there are blind spots, either because you didn't model that, or you know it's not in the data, or somehow, right? But you need to be aware of the blind spot.
Yes, I have experienced the case of running a very long modeling analysis exercise and never converging. And I was quite disheartened. Thank God I found one of the stakeholders who had a completely different understanding of the process itself. And immediately after the discussion we had, it was a couple of hours, half an hour of an interview, changing the model, and the model then converged. As simple as that. It wasn't a missed variable. It was something that was within the knowledge of someone.
Okay.
But in this case now, since unfortunately I don't have process mining to my aid back then, so it was going number crunching through the time series. But nowadays, having a process mining tool like Disco, which I'm using it for that purpose, it serves also as a proof of the concept. Generally speaking, it is obvious whether you have missed or not something.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, like you're pointing out, it's always a challenge, right? It's like whether you do it with or without process mining. These are always the challenges that you have with the simulation model, that you have to validate it and needs to match. But process mining can actually help maybe close that gap.
Dramatically. Yeah. And when money talks, we know the answer. It is quite important for the viability of modeling, generally speaking. Not only for simulation modeling, for all other types of modeling, but simulation more specifically because it is so strongly related and affected by variability. If you've not put it right, you lost accuracy.
Yeah, and it's actually... this validation step is so, as we discussed, really important, but it's also actually time consuming. So usually this kind of model tuning, that's an iterative process, and it's also in the model that we built here, right? So then we didn't get into that yet. It's not tuned yet. It doesn't really match up yet. It's like that was basically the first step. But now we would actually, if we wanted to analyze that for real, we would have to continue and really close those gaps. And well, for example, one thing we didn't talk about at all yet is resources. We didn't, so in the original data that we use here for the credit application process, we don't have any information about resources. And that's something that we saw actually. So it was one of the topics that I focused on during my PhD in the process mining group at the Technical University in Eindhoven. We were generating simulation models from process mining data. We generated it for CPN tools back then, so that's one of the academic simulation tools. And what we notice is, at first it looks really simple. You generate the model, you take all the, like we saw, you can use the distributions from all the measurements, timing measurements, probabilities, arrival rates, things like that. But then once we ran the model, the results in the simulation model were very different. It was always finished very quickly. The process didn't take, let's say, 3 days, but 3 hours or something, right? So it was really a stark difference. And the difference was that the resources that we had modeled, they were always available, right? So immediately when a job came in the simulation model, the resource immediately did the job. But of course, in reality, that's not right? The people work in different processes. processes. They are not immediately doing a job just because it's available. So then that brings you into the situation that you have to model the resources in a more realistic way to reflect reality. So that's the thing. How far do you go, right? You can't model the whole world. You can't put the whole world in the simulation model. So how much do you have to put in to be close enough to reflect what you want to reflect? To
be cost effective, more or less.
Yeah.
It is exactly the same thing with the business world. You are called and you are asked to address a real life problem, a new product, a variation to your production line, and you need to get an answer quickly because time is money at the end of the day. So you're looking for the cost effectiveness of your output, and this is very, very helpful. It is a good investment, generally speaking, for someone to invest on using process mining as well as a helping aid to speed up the simulation and the modeling process. In generally speaking, I don't want to constrain to simulation modeling only.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one thing I wanted to point out also, because I think that's it's always interesting if you can close the loop, right? But that's something that Sudhendu, we also talked about in this, in any logic, in any case. I think in several simulation tools you can do that. There is actually a possibility that I think it's here, somewhere. So you can actually log the simulation runs that you're doing. So somehow you can create an event log of the simulations. So that's a way that you can actually then analyze again with the process mining tool again from the simulation runs. Did you do that in the past?
Yes. So that is really after a lot of the work. So if you look at, let's say you build the simulation model and you run it, the first order of priority, which typically one would look at, is so if the simulation model is creating a distribution, an output distribution. Let's say we are looking at cycle time. So you get a cycle time distribution, right, from your simulation model. And you have a cycle time distribution from your process mining, which is reflective of the actual data. The difference being the simulation model is, of course, based on these statistical distributions. The process mining is real data. As we heard Lambros saying, you can never get the two distributions to match. You won't get the output of the simulation model, look at the distribution and look at the process mining actual real data distribution. They'll never match, right? Because one is based on a model. So we typically like to look at, depending again on the situation, is look at some measure of the distribution. So look at the mean, try to see if the mean is close enough. Look at the standard deviation and see if the standard deviation is close enough. Now, if you have a lot of variability in your system, which you might see in some service processes, you might want to even consider some additional moments, some higher moments, right? Like skewness or even kurtosis, or like up to the fourth moment. But typically, it'll be if you want to match data to the fourth moment, you could spend a very, very long time. But I typically would suggest that you should at least try to get the mean and the standard deviations matched. Mm-hmm. And I think if you have done that, that my model is trustworthy.
Yeah.
Also, you can receive by your applications or your trials, you can get your confidence intervals, so you can see where you are going and what is the leverage you have within your modeling. So you know whether it is something that it is very narrow or very wide, and you can act accordingly.
Yes, I mean, you could do more formal hypothesis testing on the two distributions to see if they are, basically you want to make sure that they are not different, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
you're on different. So it's a complicated. I don't think we want to get into validation, all the nuances. It's a subject in itself, I would say, of probably another session.
Yeah. No, but I think what is important for people is to be aware of the complexity, right? And to know that these are the things that they then really need to spend the time to look into and to get right. And Yeah, so maybe, so let's say that we have completed this step. So we have completed step 3, the model validation, and we get our model to match up at least closely enough so that we continue with our simulation project. So then we actually come to the 4th step. And this is now actually building the what-if scenarios, right? And so for that, I just wrote down some of the things that people change. So if you take the current reality, the SS model as a starting point, and you build what-if, that means you're changing something in the model to reflect potential changes that you could make in the real process, right? So some of the things related to processes that people could change is that they, for example, eliminate an activity, that they reduce the processing time for a particular activity, that maybe, like we said before, maybe there's kind of an unnecessary kind of rework route through the process, that instead of going through that extra unnecessary step 70% of the time, I'm reducing that to 30 or 10%. So what's the effect of that, right? I can change the waiting time and queuing in a certain part in a process. I can maybe restructure the process to say, instead of doing certain steps in sequence, I'm now doing them in parallel in the future. And by doing them in parallel, that can have an effect on the process. And other examples are maybe changes to the schedule. I think that's an example. Sudhendu, you showed at one of your post-mining camp talks. Resource allocation, decision changes, automation of steps, or maybe that a person combines 2 steps in 1 step that are normally maybe separated as 2 separate steps. But if one person can do them immediately, that's kind of often a kind of an efficiency gain. So these are kind of process improvement steps or scenarios people might consider that you can then reflect in this kind of what-if scenario modeling, and you would really model kind of this version of the process and say that's what-if scenario A, what's what-if scenario B. And so I'm curious, what are the kind of typical changes that you have made to your models when you model what if? What is typically the focus that you analyze there?
Well, it is a reduction of risk to begin with, potential new production lines, potential new production in terms of new products, basically things that will alter the planning and scheduling approaches for the manufacturing line or for any other complex system. Things that will be very costly and very complicated to run in terms of running a design of experiments, for example. Like it is less costly to run a simulation by changing some parameters and anticipating the reaction of the system rather than doing tests within the production line. That costs.
Yeah. Absolutely. And here, so you're pointing this out, that brings to mind for me that, of course, here maybe there's also a difference between production processes and service processes, because for production processes, maybe it's even more relevant, right? If you even have to build maybe a new factory or something, that's a completely,
Yes, it becomes much more complicated in this case. I'm taking less complicated cases. However, I wouldn't say that it's only the manufacturing sector. Every complex system faces exactly the same challenges. So at the end of the day, by testing something with a simulation, you are much more you're avoiding the risk of running into surprises, even if that will be to optimize your process itself by changing, let's say, break times, for example, or changing manning, or changing the availability of work centers. In a call center, of course, it will be exactly the same case to see how you will split the loads between operators. It is something you can run the what-if scenarios, see the different output you will get to your models, and then present and argue about the benefits.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these are great examples. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
I mean, it also, like as I said, I've worked in the printing industry in the past, and a lot of times people want to make, let's say, investment decisions. If you have a complex end-to-end process, people might say, I want to bring in a faster machine. But how do you know what is the impact of that faster machine on the overall end-to-end output? If you double the throughput of one component of that machine, it doesn't necessarily mean that the final output would get doubled, right? Sometimes you might see only a 5% improvement. Depends on where you are investing that capacity. So there is a lot of value in those types of scenarios that your simulation model can bring by helping you guide your investment decisions, for example. Another example I can give is if you're looking at the digital processes, there's a huge emphasis on automation, right? So if you have a multi-stage process, there's a lot of emphasis on let's automate. But how do you know that if you took a particular part of the process and automated it, what is the impact on the overall end-to-end output? It may not, there's no way, there's no magic number that somebody can just cook up and say, here's a sub-process within this process that I've automated and I have saved like 30% of my time. That doesn't mean that your overall end-to-end cycle time will go down by 30%, right? It might only go down by 2%. So those types of decisions when you have to make, for example, I have looked at it when you have looked at an end-to-end process in a digital world, and we see an opportunity to automate a sub-process. If we have built a simulation model, we can actually, before we even automate, we can test what the impact of that sub-process automation will be on the key metrics of interest. And then you can decide, if it's going to have a significant impact, then you automate. If it's not going to have a significant impact, maybe you can, continue as is for now. And these kind of complex interactions that exist in the process, I mean, it's almost impossible to estimate these kind of what-if scenarios without some type of a trustworthy model.
Also, I would like to argue with regards to some equally important aspects, which is work in progress. This is the holy grail in the manufacturing. You want to keep your work in progress as low as possible. You don't want to have a lot of constraint and confined capital in your processes. You need to process as fast as possible and to deliver as fast as possible. Also, you have the dynamics between variable and fixed costs. So all of these aspects cannot be realized by just using static calculations. It is impossible to do that accurately. So through the simulation and checking of what-if scenarios and going again and again and again, you can get exactly what would be the picture of a work in progress, your costs, as well as your lead times, which is another big contributor to cost reduction and profit maximization. Okay, so the slight change of 2%, as Sudhendu mentioned, might lead to a huge improvement to lead time. Therefore, the stakeholders, the senior management might decide to go through that route instead of spending millions of pounds to add another line in parallel, let's say, increasing all the cost.
That's such a good point, because you mentioned like work in progress, cost, and lead time, right? These are different dimensions.
The fixed cost remains the same. Okay, therefore the only change you have is in variable cost, and the variable cost is per hour. Okay, so by changing your production practices and by getting a more efficient production line, you are reducing basically your cost per unit of produce. As simple as that. Plus, you are improving your lead time, which is another great contributor to profitability. And all of this can be realized later on by running small experiments. So if you could decide a what-if scenario, you can run a small experiment and you can see the real-time data through the process mining approach.
Yes, and these outcomes are then also what you compare the different what-if scenarios on, right? So for example, if you have A, B, C, D, 3, 4 alternative what if scenarios, these might be different ideas like about what could
Correct.
be changed about the current process. So then you evaluate them with respect to this target metric or this output, which could be, but it could have effects on multiple dimensions, right? It could have a positive effect on cost, but a negative effect on work in progress, or the other way around, right? It's not always
all simulation applications, all simulation software have the capacity of receiving cost and profits variables, as well as variables contributing to environmental impact. This is another huge aspect. Okay, environmental liability to business is huge, and all businesses want to reduce their environmental impact. We all want to be socially correct to begin with. Therefore, you can also simulate and see the impact to these factors, which are quite well hidden if you will follow any other modeling practice.
Yeah, no, that's another good example. And that's, of course, also then what in the fifth step, when you compare the before and after. So that's how you, first of all, that's how you compare the different what if scenarios. But also once you actually make the change, of course, you want to verify how big the effect was based on what you had hoped based on the simulation, right? So you can then compare the predicted kind of simulation effect and the actual effect, again then with process mining by looking at the actual process. And so you do this based on this kind of target metric. And so we mentioned quite a few already: work in progress, cost, environmental issues. Sometimes it's also maybe more qualitative things, like for example, if you relate to customer service, maybe you want to be on time, or have less missed deadlines, or some kind of more.
You have the opportunity of getting this information if you will validate it, and you're certain, you are confident that you can execute it. You can offer it as a potential to your customer. If that brings down the cost to your customer as well, and increase the satisfaction levels, this is a win-win scenario for everyone.
Yeah. So I'm curious, maybe Sudhendu, based on this example that you had earlier, which we will link in the show notes, where you're looking at the way the scheduling was changed. So there, basically, how the work was assigned to people was changed, and it had quite a big effect. But when you evaluate then the effect or the target output of these kind of what if scenarios, and also then in the before and after comparison, are you typically looking at kind of one main metric like throughput time, or is there also sometimes like a conjunction of targets that need to be balanced? I think we can't hear you right now. Can you? I'm not sure whether it's just me or whether there's something.
No, I can hear you very well, and it must be an issue from Sudhendu's computer.
Yeah, but can you hear him, or can you only hear me?
I can only hear you, Anne.
Okay, yeah, I think we have a technical issue right now. So
let me pick it up up until we'll manage to sort that out. Comparisons can be made based on the standard operating procedures of companies. Okay, there are benefits that you can realize immediately, but there's also information which can be used to draw strategy. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that strategy could be either on your production or with your relationship with your customers and so on.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we're running a little bit late, but I wanted to, before we close, I wanted to actually come back to what we discussed in the beginning, that we're here focusing on discrete event simulation, but you also mentioned in between, like it's not just for simulation modeling, but for all kinds of modeling. I would be curious, can you tell us a little bit, just really briefly, about the other types of simulation which are not discrete event simulation, and how do you think process mining can contribute to those as well?
Well, as we discussed before, by looking the data and the dynamics of a system, we can identify many aspects that are of interest. Okay, discrete event simulation is based on discrete events. The other types of simulation modeling methods we follow is system dynamics, which is based on flows and stocks of variables, and we are modeling based on differential equations and the rate of change of something. So you might not be necessarily interested on identifying exactly how many entities of something you want to produce, but you want to identify the dynamics into your system and see how your strategy will change within the next foreseeable future, let's say, to make a good estimate, to see how a product will move within the markets. In these cases, you can use system dynamics. Again, by getting the data and going through process mining, you can see these dynamics. You demonstrated earlier the different activities and the way they were interacting one to the other. And this can give valuable information with regards to the flows and also with regards to the impacts these dynamics might have. It could show relationships between different activities. And also you could also understand by running the simulation, the real-time playback of the data. You can also see the dynamics happening in front of your time. You can see bottlenecks, you can see slow reaction of a system, and this can be represented into a system dynamic model.
Yeah.
Now, with regards to agent-based modeling, which is the third method for simulation modeling, at least to that extent, that models also knowledge and experience of agents. And I believe, I have not done this myself, but I believe that in a case of a production line, you could also see different patterns of behavior between different shifts of operators or different paradigms or different standard operating procedures from different groups of people. It is obvious that you can realize things much earlier, at an earlier stage, and it is critical that at this stage you can decide which method to follow. This is another big thing into the simulation modeling world, discussed a lot, of how early you need to react in order to be more effective. The earlier you identify the good method, the better it will be for the modeling process itself.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you very much for that perspective here towards the end. Let's just see, Sudhendu, can you hear us again? Are you back?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, we can hear you again. Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good.
Do you want to add something before we close?
No, I think Lambros pretty much. So if you look at any logic, which is one of the simulation tools that we use, it has the ability to. You can use all three types of simulation models within that environment, which is quite good. Most of my experience, to be honest, has been with discrete event simulation. I know that if you are, for example, if you're trying to study emergent behavior and things of that nature, sometimes agent-based modeling is a better framework for those things. Like, for example, if you're trying to model the pandemic or those types of things where you want to look at more emergent behavior, and that's the focus. But by and large, for most of the work that I have done, which has been in the printing industry, which is more like manufacturing, services, digital processes, insurance, finance, discrete event simulation has been quite effective. What has been the big evolution in the last 2 decades is this emergence of process mining, which we talked here. And the other things where I've seen a lot of improvements that have been made or progress that has been made is in the area of simulation optimization, right? So I know we haven't necessarily talked about it. So we talked about how do we collect the data, we build the simulation model, we validate it, and then do what ifs. But you can also conceive doing formal optimization on these simulation models. And the challenge there is, of course, because the simulation model is a stochastic model, it is the output of the model is not the same every time you run it. We talked about that. It makes it very challenging to do what I would call formal optimization, and that's this big field of simulation optimization. And so that would be, but once you have formulated a problem properly, now you have the ability, even AnyLogic provides you some capability in along those lines using OptQuest module that they have, where you can actually build the model and then do automated optimization.
And that's interesting. So that's kind of an operations research kind of approaches that are integrated. Interesting. Yeah.
So those are the two areas where I have seen some significant enhancement, in addition to the question that was raised earlier about how AI and predictive analytics can be combined with simulation. So maybe those three, I would say, are the big areas where I would have seen some, sort of significant addition to what we had, let's say, almost 2 decades ago.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. I think it's a big topic, but we covered a lot of ground. I think as much as we can in 1.5 hours, and so I think that's the idea, is to give you a starting point for your own maybe simulation projects. When we publish the recording, we will link to all these additional pointers that we mentioned throughout the show, and. So I hope it was useful. Thank you both, Lambros. Thank you, Sudhendu, for joining, for coming on the show. It was really great and really nice to have you here and very helpful.
Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity.
Thank you both. And thank you again all for watching. We will be back with a new Process Mining Café in about 3 weeks, I think even. And we will talk about the difference between project-based and process-driven companies and how that reflects on your process mining initiatives. So tune back in and we'll see you again in the next café. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.